So you are in a front-end system design interview and you got asked, design a Typeahead search box. Sounds simple, right? But the moment you start explaining, you hit the wall. Should I start with components? Should I talk about APIs? How about handle loading status and network errors? It's overwhelming unless you have a structure. That's where the CCDAO framework comes in. It's a mental model I use to stay organized, cover what interviewers care about, and show senior level thinking. Today, I will show you how I apply CCDAO framework step by step to design a fully featured Typeahead component. So CCDAO stands for Collect Information, Component Structure, Data Modeling, API Design, and Optimization Strategies. Think of this as a layered system. Start with understand the problem, then build up towards architecture and refinement. So a Typeahead search component is something like you would use in a Google when you want to search for React, let's say. As you type, you can see it has auto-completion for you that matching what you typed. So let's say React, as you type React atom patterns, and you will see something to pop up. And that's one form of the Typeahead. And there are definitely a lot of other forms of the Typeahead. This is a very typical one that when you type, it will send a request to a remote server and get a response to run this list. And as you can see, there is some icons, maybe search by voice, by image, or clean the button, and so on and so forth. And that's a very common one. And for some other scenarios, for example, in here, let's say I want to search for purse. Because I live in Australia, maybe the data can be fetched before I even type. So it could be not sending request to the remote server, but instead it searches against the local data set. And that's something we want to design in this section. And then I would like to start with some clarification questions. The very first question I would like normally ask is the scale. So I would say, what is the scale of the application? Like, is that millions of records in a system, or just like a few hundreds or thousands? What is the scale of the application? That's something I would like to ask first. And the second one is very common. So I would like to ask the devices we want to support. So devices, maybe it's mobile, or we want to support desktop as well, or probably it's not have some other variations. We want to know that beforehand. And then I would like to ask the data. So where the data stored? Is that remote? For example, we have to have an API to fetch the data, or we are searching against the local. Like we can fetch and store the data beforehand and save it in the front end, and later on we can use that data without fetching through the network. And then we can ask a question like, do we need to personalize the search result? So for example, if I search in Google for something, it will have some result for me, like personalized, but it's not necessarily the same as you search in your laptop. And then we can also ask questions like, do we need to pagination? Do we need to show all the data in a paginated result, and you can scroll to load more, or pagination, or we show only the top X items. I think Google only give you top 10 results for a particular keyword, and in that case you can search all, and then when you scroll, you can always get the next page, things like that. And this is all about the happy path. So if you want to demonstrate more depth of your thinking, you can ask questions like, do we need to handle the arrow how can we show the indicator of loading status. So this is also the very good way to demonstrate your depth of thinking. Arrow loading status. You probably want to show a skeleton or something like that when you loading the data, and when you have an arrow, you probably can have a fallback or things like that. And also you may ask a question like what if the system is offline? But for each item, we can also ask question like what types do we support? Is that only a simple text in a list item, or do we want to support images, icons, more elements in a individual list item? And then I probably will ask question like accessibility considerations, like a keyboard navigation. So here I just give you a few examples. You can use that guideline and ask questions beforehand. So this collecting information step will take you around 5 minutes, because you will have some questions and answer. You may have some follow-up questions to clarify with the interviewers, and that will help you to have a fully understanding of the scope of the design you are aiming for. So the next step we will need to think of is the component structure. So the Typeahead component is not super complicated, but it can be. So we need to design the overall structure of the component. So in short, it can be a simple input box. We probably can have a search icon here, or some kind of like a clean when it's when there are some contacts in it. And this is the search input. And also we will need a list of results. And this is linked to the previous question, like do we need to pagination, or how complicated for each individual list item. So this will be the list. And inside the list, there'll be a list item. It could be super complicated, but I guess most of the cases, people tend to make it simple at first, and then we can gradually adding more features on top of it. So for example, we probably will need to support a image here, and we probably will need some kind of like description or links in it, and probably some text here. And that means when user click on each of the list item, we can navigate them to somewhere, maybe a search query or something. And this is surely the happy path. We will also need to consider something like, when it's loading, we probably will showing something like a loading indicator, or when something went wrong, we will need to consider a error message in some way, like say it's a exclaimer here, or with something like we might to say the error happened. This is very good talking point that you can have with your interviewer about like how do we think about this error, and what's the interaction should be here. And there could be a few other discussion points here. I will just simply list them here. Where the state lives, state management. So for example, we want to manage or like store this data into somewhere in the front end, and we want to design that, or like talking about that at least. You can use like a React context, or you want to use some third-party library like Redux or some kind of the storage. So you may want to consider the offline, the cache in here as well, to talk about the state management. Especially for these UI elements, you probably will need to consider the headless component pattern. If that's something new to you, I have published a article in martinfollow.com about the headless component pattern. You can probably have a read there. And we can also ask a question like, do we have a UI library design system in some way that we can use in such implementation? But again, this is a system design interview. we don't necessarily need to really implement it, but it's a good habit to ask questions like this. It will demonstrate your understanding. And we can also ask questions like the keyboard navigation in here again, keyboard the behavior of the accessibility. So for example, if the pop-up has already shows up, you can use the navigation key to navigate the list items. So this is a very simplified version of the component design. You will need to talk about the happy paths, the UI structure, the variation of the UI, and also you need to think about the unhappy paths like the loading status, the arrow, the offline in here as well. Like what kind of message do you want to deliver it to your user? For example, if it's offline, and obviously you cannot search anything. If it's a remote kind of component, and then you need to show message to your user like currently the server is offline, we cannot perform any search. You might need to ask them to do something else, or like retry after a few minutes. So this is all about the discussion of the structure. And the next step will be the data modeling. It's kind of linked to what we are going to render in a UI, but that could be a separate story here. We can have another canvas here and draw it a little bit more details. So because we are dealing with a list, so by default we will need a list for sure. And for elements inside that list, we will design that a little bit like so. Obviously, we will need an ID for each item, which is a string. And then we will need a label, at least, to demonstrate the results. And then we probably will need a URL in some way. It's like really optional string, and you will need to discuss with your interviewer what exactly we want to action when user click the item. So we probably will need some image. It really depends on the question you got clarified in the first step. Do we need to support like the complicated type, or we just dealing with a simple label only? So this is the simplest version of the data structure, but it could be more complicated. Like you might have a group in a list. You might have multiple sections in a search result. So for example, if you might have things like trading section, which has its own list, and it may have a recent list as well. You probably will have other sections like personalized section. It could be something else. And for each of the list, the element will be something like this. But another variation is you have a fixed number of lists. For example, you have a list, and then you have a group. Maybe group have an ID or something like that. It's a string. And then you have the items in the group. For each item, it will be this item. And then you potentially can have multiple groups, like another group, which is another string. And in the group, it has its own items, which is an item type that lives inside. And each item will be the same items here. And another very common variation is paginated items. So for example, if you, in the first step, you clarify like we need to support pagination instead of the top 10, we will need to think about the pagination information here. For pagination, that is definitely a very big topic. You could have multiple strategies to paginate your result. For example, you could have the offset-based pagination or cursor-based pagination. It will end up with different type of the data structure. But normally you would have something like in the result, you will have a page info alongside the search result, and in it you will have something like it's object basically. Let's say we are in a page number. Maybe it's a number of which page you are in, and the page size, how many items in the page. It's another number. And it has next is normally one of the field in the page info as well, which is a boolean. And this is the page info, and then that's alongside the page info you will have the items list, and this is the normal result, and the list info will be the list here. And again, it's basically really linked to the questions you got answered in the previous step, whether it's offset-based pagination or it's cursor-based pagination, but it will have a similar structure. And the page info will be vary based on the strategy you defined earlier. But fundamentally, you will need something like this one to define the basic shape of your list item. And on top of that, you can use this type in here, or in here, and in here. So this is basically the data modeling step you want to work through. Once we have the data model clarified, we can move on to the next step, which is API design. Now we can talk about the API design. So basically, we will need a way for the front end to get the server-side response to do some data exchange with send a query and get response, and pass the data structure to fit the UI need, and then render it correspondingly. When it comes to API design, the by default one will be the RESTful API, which is universally well understood and widely used. So we will start from that and then see how we can, using different techniques. So we can start from the RESTful API by saying that it's normally a API search, and then you give a query equals to the URL equated query. So for example, if you type in the UI, say React, and we will need to pass in this data to the query parameter here, and then it will talk to the backend and get the response. This is how you do a RESTful API normally. It's a GET request, and you can determine the response by saying the status, messages, things like that. It's a pretty standard practice to do that in RESTful API. But we can also talk about different protocols like the GraphQL. It's basically another way to organize your API, and the way you consume the response from a GraphQL will be very different from the RESTful API. And in addition, here we probably will need to consider the pagination if that's part of the requirement. So we'll need to think about the query parameter by saying the page size or the page number. For example, if you want to get 8 more items for the page number 2, and we can send that as part of the parameter here as well, and that will be a query string. And for GraphQL, the request will be different. So basically we'll need to compose a query by saying query name. Let's say it's a search query, and we want to define the keyword, which will be a string. In backend, we'll need some query. Let's say it's a search or something. It's defined in backend, and that accepting the keywords. Probably we can define the pagination info as well in here. So we can say like its page size, page number, and then it will be address, and in Edge it has nodes, and in Node it has ID, text, images, URL, things like that, and also the page info. As part of the payload, we want to make it like a curse based response, and has next, things like that. It's pretty standard way to do it in GraphQL, and it's a very different way compared to the RESTful API. You don't have to go very deep here, but it's a good practice to mention different variations, and it's a good practice, I guess, to talk about the pros and cons of each option, and you probably will give it a like flexibility, how easy you want to extend the API as you go. So for example, you want to extend the search a little bit more. So like before you don't have the pagination, you want to add that pagination, how easily to do that with RESTful API or GraphQL. And you probably will need to do some mutation as well, or like change the backend, how easily to do that with RESTful API compared to the GraphQL approach. So this is definitely something you want to talk about after you describe the basic usage of RESTful API and GraphQL. You need to list all the pros and cons. You can do some homework before you talk about each option. And also, if we have some real-time requirement, we might need to consider the WebSocket as well. So you can get the real-time notification when something happens in the backend. The GraphQL, for example, have that mechanism already. You can use a subscribe to achieve this kind of real-time notification. But for RESTful API, you cannot do that easily. You will need to upgrade to the WebSocket to achieve that real-time notification. But I guess it's not the case here, because in our domain we will search and then get a response. We don't have any the real-time requirement. But I guess one more thing we can talk about here is the cache mechanism. So for example, if we type very fast to something and we want to save the result for later, because network request is very expensive, especially on the mobile devices. And think of that, you have 5G in a subway, the connection is slow. In such cases, you will try to avoid to send as much requests. So you want to save the response in your local devices first. And later on, when you have a stable network, you can resume the connection and get the response when you type. And last but definitely not the least is the optimization strategies. This is actually the most important part in the CCDAO framework, because everyone can talk about data shape, component design, even the API design. It's okay. It's simple and straightforward. There's not much things to talk about. But for optimization, there's so many things you can explore and discuss with your interviewer. So for example, performance definitely is something you want to talk about with your interviewer. And the security considerations you want to raise as well. And the accessibility, you can talk about that here. And you can also talk about offline mode. How do you respond for this? Happy passes like a loading status, error handling. You can all talk about that as well. Internationalization, you can talk about that as well. And for each item list here, you can also talk about them in depth. For example, in performance, you can talk about the cache. For example, that's a big topic already itself. And also you can talk about the flickness, the network flickness, which is inevitable in our case, because when you search, when you type very fast, you will definitely run into the race conditioning. Like the previous request respond slowly than the later request. If you haven't yet, I have made some videos before about the race conditioning, request to vote for. You can watch them to have a better understanding. But in here, we will just list a few cases we can talk about. The debounce throttling, as well here, because we don't want to send network request for every keystroke. And all of this can be part of the performance. And in addition, for example, the cache can be also like in a front-end cache, or there is a gateway cache, or what do you call that, the reverse proxy cache, or backend cache. So basically, you can talk about the cache in different scenarios as well. And talk about the cache, you will likely talk about the algorithm as well. And that will be another big topic, like how do you invalidate a cache? Things like that. It's a very big topic. And for the risk conditioning, you can talk about controller to cancel the previous request, or you can talk about some third-party library like a React query, or maybe you're talking about the relay if you're choosing the GraphQL. And the security as well, there are so many things you can talk about, like a security test, security, building security in the front end, how do you manage the tokens, like that in here. Accessibility, also you can talk about the semantic HTML, using ARIA labels, and how to test the accessibility. And also you can talk about the offline handling, loading status, error handling, and internationalization, or different type of requirement. So I would say you can leave 10 to 15 minutes for these optimization strategies, because there are so many things to talk about, and each one can. For example, sometimes based on your interviewer's experience or their expertise, they might be very interested in Relay or GraphQL based on their experience, or they want to talk about the throttling, debouncing, and how can you implement one, or they are very interested in test the accessibility part. You can also talk about that. And so if they have UX background, maybe they want to talk about the skeleton or loading to make the user feel your application is faster. So basically in this step, you would like to demonstrate the birds of your knowledge. You are not only consider the make it work, you also consider the fact that make your application more robust, security, and faster, and accessibility, all these kind of supporting or non-functional requirements. And that's how you divide a senior role from a mid-level role. So that's how I apply the CCDAO framework to a real front-end system design problem. It helped me to stay calm, organized, and cover all the key angles interviewers care about. And now it's your turn. Try applying it into a different component, like a pagination, auto-completion, or a modal dialog, and let me know how it goes. And if you would like me to walk through another example using CCDAO framework, drop it in the comments below. Thanks.